May 1942. The Strait of Dover, in darkness. 3 British motor torpedo boats are running without navigation lights at 35 knots, their Packard engines throttled back to reduce the distinctive roar that carries across the water. The crews can hear the thrum of heavier machinery somewhere ahead. German ships. A convoy moving through waters the enemy believes they control. The lead boat displaces just 38 tons. Her hull is built from Honduras mahogany planking over Canadian rock elm frames, the same construction technique used for racing yachts before the war. She carries enough high-octane aviation fuel to travel 200 miles, and a single rifle bullet could penetrate her sides. The commanding officer is 22 years old. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, 4 German torpedo boats are escorting the auxiliary cruiser Steer toward the Atlantic. Each of those escorts displaces over 900 tons. Each carries guns that could reduce the British boats to splinters in seconds. The largest of the German vessels stretches 87 meters from bow to stern. The British boat measures just 70 feet. What happened next would demonstrate why the Admiralty had been catastrophically wrong about coastal warfare, and why the officers who had dismissed these plywood craft as expensive toys would never quite live down the humiliation. The problem facing British naval planners at the start of World War II was both obvious and ignored. In 1919, British coastal motorboats carried out one of the most audacious raids in naval history. 7 tiny craft penetrated the Soviet naval base at Kronstadt and sank a cruiser and a submarine depot ship. 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded that night. Lieutenant Augustus Agar received his medal for an earlier raid in the same campaign, when his single boat torpedoed a Soviet cruiser while evading shore batteries and destroyer escorts. The lesson seemed clear. Small, fast craft with torpedo armament could strike targets that conventional warships could never reach. The Admiralty drew a different conclusion. They disbanded the coastal motorboat flotillas by 1922. The capabilities that had proven so valuable against Soviet harbors were allowed to atrophy through 2 decades of peacetime neglect. When war returned in September 1939, the Royal Navy possessed exactly 3 motor torpedo boat flotillas, 18 boats in total. Half of those were stationed in Malta and Hong Kong, useless for channel operations. The force that should have been guarding British coastal waters existed more on paper than in practice. The men who understood what this meant were not primarily naval officers. They were yacht designers, racing boat builders, and engineers from firms that had spent the interwar years perfecting high-speed craft for wealthy sportsmen. Hubert Scott Payne at British Powerboat Company in Hythe had been building racing boats capable of 50 knots. Vosper and Company in Portsmouth constructed racing yachts for international competition. These civilians would build the weapons the Admiralty refused to take seriously. The technical challenge was formidable. A motor torpedo boat needed to be fast enough to attack and escape before enemy guns could range on target. That meant speeds above 35 knots. But torpedo tubes, deck guns, and enough fuel for operational range all added weight. Weight killed speed. The solution required construction methods that minimized every unnecessary ounce while maintaining structural integrity in heavy seas. The builders turned to techniques developed for racing yachts. Double diagonal planking used 2 layers of thin mahogany set at opposing angles to the keel, creating a skin that flexed with wave action rather than fighting it. Canadian rock elm frames provided the skeleton. British Columbia cedar formed the deck planking. The entire structure weighed roughly half what conventional steel construction would require for equivalent strength. Double diagonal and mahogany made high speed possible. The Vosper 70-foot design that emerged in 1940 displaced between 33 and 38 tons, depending on equipment fit. 3 Packard supercharged V12 engines, originally designed for American racing boats, delivered over 4,000 brake horsepower. The boats could reach 39 knots in calm water, though operational speeds rarely exceeded 35. 2 21-inch torpedo tubes provided the main armament. Machine guns handled close defense. The 70-foot Vosper married speed with power. The price of this performance was terrifying vulnerability. The mahogany hull offered no protection whatsoever. Armor did not exist. The fuel tanks contained aviation gasoline rated at 100 octane, the same fuel used by Spitfires and Hurricanes. A single incendiary round into the engine compartment meant fire. Fire meant explosion. The crews called their vessels floating firebombs and meant it without affection. Vulnerability and fire were constant companions. Robert Hitchens, who would become the most decorated Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve officer of the war, described the situation in terms that still resonate. He wrote that coastal forces fought on two fronts. One was against the declared enemy. The other was against recalcitrant authority within their own service. Admiralty experts who had never visited a coastal base and never put to sea in a motor torpedo boat issued endless regulations governing equipment and tactics. The men who actually fought the war learned to work around instructions that bore no relationship to operational reality. Coastal forces had to improvise to survive. The crews manning these boats were not career naval officers. The Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve provided the bulk of personnel, men who wore wavy gold stripes on their sleeves rather than the straight stripes of regular Navy officers. Volunteers filled the boats and kept them fighting. Before the war, they had been solicitors, accountants, yacht club members, and university students. The average age in a motor torpedo boat crew was barely 20. A lieutenant commanding a flotilla would have been 12th in the chain of command aboard a cruiser. In coastal forces, he was responsible for multiple boats and dozens of lives. By 1945, this amateur navy had grown to the point where volunteer reserve officers outnumbered regular Royal Navy officers 3-1. The service that the Admiralty had neglected became dependent on the civilians who stepped forward to fill the gap. The turning point came in February 1942, and it was a disaster that forced change. On the 12th of that month, the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, broke out of Brest Harbor and ran up the English Channel in daylight. The Channel Dash humiliated British defenses. Aircraft attacks failed. Destroyer strikes failed. 5 motor torpedo boats, including 3 that would fight again 3 months later, attacked the German squadron in conditions that should have been impossible. The weather that day registered Force 6 on the Beaufort scale. Official doctrine stated that torpedoes should not be fired above Force 3. The boats launched anyway. All torpedoes missed, defeated by the sea state rather than German defensive fire. But the willingness of those crews to attack capital ships in conditions their own weapons were not rated to handle demonstrated something the Admiralty could no longer ignore. Investment in coastal forces accelerated. 3 months later, on the night of May 13, 1942, 3 of those same boats would prove what proper support could achieve. The German convoy that night consisted of the auxiliary cruiser Steyr, disguised as a minesweeper, escorted by 4 torpedo boats and 16 R-boat minesweepers. The torpedo boat escorts were Sea Adler, Condor, Falk, and Iltis, each displaced between 800 and 930 tons. Each carried 2 105mm guns and torpedo tubes of their own. They were purpose-built warships, crewed by professionals, operating in waters they had patrolled for 2 years. Motor torpedo boats 219, 220, and 221 of the 6th MTB flotilla intercepted the convoy in the Dover Strait sometime after 3 in the morning. Motor gunboats from the 2nd flotilla provided additional support. The attack came out of complete darkness. German radar had detected the approaching contacts. German lookouts had heard engine noise, but the attackers remained invisible until torpedoes were already running. MTB 219 was commanded by temporary sub-lieutenant Mark Arnold Forster, 22 years old, educated at Gordonstoun, a former merchant seaman who had joined the Volunteer Reserve when war began. He had already participated in the Channel Dash action 3 months earlier. He would survive the war to become a distinguished journalist and author, though he rarely spoke of his naval service. His book, The World at War, written to accompany the landmark television documentary, never mentioned his own combat experience. If you are finding this deep dive into British naval engineering interesting, consider subscribing. It helps the channel continue producing content like this. Now, back to what happened when those torpedoes found their targets. The torpedo that struck Iltis broke the ship in two. German survivors described hearing the motorboat engines, tracking contacts on radar, ordering full speed astern to evade, and then the catastrophic impact amidships. The bow and stern sections separated within minutes. Sea Adler took her hit between 9 and 15 minutes later, depending on which source you trust. Her captain was hurled from the bridge by the explosion. The ship sank with heavy loss of life. German casualties across both vessels ranged from 118 to over 200 men, depending on the accounting. The discrepancy reflects the chaos of night action and incomplete records. What is certain is that two steel warships, each displacing more than 20 times the weight of their attackers, went to the bottom of the Dover Strait before dawn. The British did not escape unscathed. Motor Torpedo Boat 220 was lost during the action, sunk with her commander, Lieutenant E.A.E. Cornish, and 7 of her crew. Motor Gunboat 9 was so badly damaged she never returned to operational service. The price of victory was real, but the exchange rate favored the plywood boats. The German perspective on these attacks reveals why coastal forces tactics worked. Survivors described the terror of fighting an enemy they could not see. The motor torpedo boats ran at high speed, launched their weapons, and reversed course before German guns could acquire targets. The attackers appeared as engine noise in the darkness, momentary shapes against the lighter horizon. Then, nothing. By the time searchlights swept the area, the British were gone. This was not the only success that spring. British motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats fought dozens of engagements in the Channel and North Sea throughout 1942. The cumulative effect forced German convoys to route further from British coastal waters, adding time and fuel cost to every supply run. The nuisance that the Admiralty had dismissed became a strategic factor that German naval planners could not ignore. The commanders who emerged from this campaign became legends within the service, though few achieved wider recognition. Robert Hichens earned the Distinguished Service Order with bar and the Distinguished Service Cross with 2 bars, making him the most decorated volunteer reserve officer of the entire war. He was killed in action on the night of April 12, 1943, aged 34, having refused multiple offers of promotion and shore duty. His book, We Fought Them in Gunboats, was published posthumously in 1944, with 33,000 words cut by wartime censors. The restored edition finally appeared in 2023. Peter Scott, son of the Antarctic explorer, commanded motor gunboats and steam gunboats throughout the campaign. He painted his experiences in watercolors between actions and wrote The Battle of the Narrow Seas in 1945, still considered the definitive contemporary account. After the war, he founded the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and co-founded the World Wildlife Fund. Few remember that the conservationist who created the World Wildlife Fund panda logo spent his war years commanding gunboats in the English Channel. The statistics by the war's end told the story of Vindication. Coastal forces had grown from 18 boats to over 2,000. 3,000 officers and 22,000 ratings served in motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats, and steam gunboats. The service earned more than 3,000 gallantry decorations, a higher proportion than any other branch of the Royal Navy. 4 Victoria Crosses were awarded to coastal forces personnel. The Steer, the auxiliary cruiser that escaped in May 1942, reached the Gironde estuary and eventually broke out into the Atlantic. She sank 4 merchant ships totaling nearly 30,000 tons before encountering the American Liberty ship, Stephen Hopkins, on September 27, 1942. In the ensuing firefight, both ships were destroyed. Steyr became the only German surface warship sunk by an American merchant vessel during the entire war. MTB 219, the boat that Mark Arnold Forster commanded that night in May 1942, still exists. After the war, she served with the Sea Cadet Corps at Staines, then became a houseboat on the Chelsea embankment for 50 years. She was acquired for preservation in 2021 and now sits under conservation at Gosport, still bearing damage from her wartime service. She is the only surviving vessel of her class. The lesson of the motor torpedo boat campaign was one the Admiralty should have learned from Kronstadt in 1919, but refused to accept until combat forced the issue. Small craft built for speed and striking power could achieve results that conventional warships could not. The men who manned those craft, volunteers who learned seamanship on weekend sailing trips and warfighting in actual combat, performed at levels their professional critics thought impossible. Returned to the Strait of Dover in May 1942. Those German torpedo boat crews advancing through waters they believed secure had every reason for confidence. The British boats that intercepted them displaced 1/25 of their tonnage. The British crews were reserves, not regulars. The British weapons were mounted on yacht hulls that any deck gun could shatter. None of that mattered when torpedoes found their targets in darkness. British yacht builders working in boatyards designed for racing craft had constructed vessels capable of sinking purpose-built warships. Weekend sailors commanding those vessels had outfought professional naval crews. The branch the Admiralty had dismissed as a wasteful distraction earned more gallantry awards per capita than any other part of the Royal Navy. The experts who refused to fund coastal forces before the war learned their lesson in fire and wreckage on the Channel floor. German engineering had produced steel warships with heavy armor and professional crews. British engineering produced mahogany boats with no armor at all and volunteer crews who attacked anyway. That was British engineering.